Let me say hello and welcome to episode 30 of On Liberty, coming to you live from the Center for Independent Studies in Sydney, Australia. I'm your host, Salvatore Babonis. My guest today is barrister, law lecturer, and board director Sophie York, who joins us to discuss the importance of religious freedom as the foundation for all of our freedoms. Sophie York, how are you?
Oh, feeling great, Salvatore. It's such an honor to be here speaking with you.
Oh, it's much more an honor to have you on the show. And I hear you want to make a few shout outs to some friends who are watching.
Salvatore, before we go into it, can I give a big shout out for the lovely people at Excelsior, Campion, Notre Dame, Sydney, and of course to Paul and my boys. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. You better be watching now that you got your plug out there. Sophie, you've written that, quote, religion is an essential part of the experience of being human and always has been. Now, do you really mean that? Is religion so much at our, well, forgive me, in our souls?
Yeah, look, Salvatore, if I can sort of start with the basic principles, humans are physical, they're intellectual, but they're also spiritual. So that's so integral to what we are as people. And we know from our studies of humankind, and in fact, we still have some of the earliest legal codes from the Code of Namu, 21 BC, 2100 BC, the Code of Hammurabi, 1754 BC. We know from even these earliest legal codes, they're still in existence, that they had a concept, they had an understanding of the fact that humans had this concept of bodily integrity that ought not to be interfered with, and that they had human life, which was sacred and deserved protection by the rulers and so forth. So we actually even have records now, anthropological records, which support this understanding. And of course, those early legal codes were well informed by ancient religions. So whether it was, the Mosaic Code or whatever, they drew from those codes their understanding about the importance of human life and to be fully human, to think, to speak, to move, to associate with others, to procreate and have a conscience and so forth. So, yeah, there's no question there. And, of course, obviously, over time, we've seen it, acknowledged in Magna Carta of 1215 and the later renditions, 1225, 1297. It's in the Parliament House of Canberra. So one of the first things that Magna Carta acknowledged was that churches should be free and that people should have religious liberty. And we draw heavily from Magna Carta. We even have put the right to a jury trial and so forth. And that's based on the fact that you can't have your liberty to move around taken from you without someone alerting you to what you're being charged with and you having the right to defend it. It's all based on this concept of you being a free, autonomous, independent human being. So it's been in the world, across the world, the understanding since time immemorial. So there's no question there. It's whether or not people actually know their history, I guess, or even understand that concept. So, that's...
Let me challenge you on that a bit, because what I know about Magna Carta and some of these earlier codes is that the only people who could write were the priests. And so, of course, if you get a priest to write your law code, you're going to have a law that enshrines religion in some sense. There you go. There's your Magna Carta. But how much? I'm just kidding there, of course. But you brought
fair cop. And can I just say this? I think you'll find it was more the barons who didn't want to pay tax who got it. They were very cross at this, arbitrary increasing of tax all the time. So it wasn't drafted by church leaders. It was put together, and in fact, the ruling King John of the day met with the barons at Runnymede in a flat field with no bushes. They were so sort of wary of each other. They didn't want to be attacked. And it really arguably came about because they thought that if there was this taxation, there should be representation. They should have a say in how their own money was spent, and it shouldn't just be increased ad nauseum and until they were living as paupers. So it was sort of setting the terms of what we now understand as a form of constitutional monarchy. And as time has gone on, we've developed the democracy. And of course, Australia is a constitutional monarchy which has a democracy that operates within that stricture. So, but that document didn't create the rights, and it wasn't produced by a church to dictate anything. It was actually sort of yielded up by the populace, by representatives who are willing to take on the fight, but not create those rights, acknowledge those rights. Does that make sense? So really just put them into writing, and clerks wrote them, and they sent copies to all the corners of England, and it was very extraordinary what they encapsulated there. Wonderful, actually, and we've got a copy of the 1297 version in our country, so it's wonderful.
Well, you've pulled out your Magna Carta and your Australian Constitution, but let me respond with the United States Constitution, which, of course, when the Constitution was passed, the Bill of Rights was demanded by the people, not by the elite. The Bill of Rights was demanded by the people, and the first right they demanded in the Bill of Rights was Article 1, Congress shall make no law establishing a religion or prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Now, we in the United States are very aware that religious freedom is the foundation of all of our freedoms. It's right there in print in the Constitution. How does that play out in the common law countries of the United Kingdom and Australia? I mean, how do you guys feel about freedom of religion and how it's related to the rest of your freedoms?
Well, I'm so glad you've asked. I don't remember this being actually specifically on the list of questions, but
I reserve the right. I reserve the right.
So glad you asked, because it's a bit of a favourite topic, in fact. And if you go to section 116 of the Constitution, you'll see our Constitution now. You'll see that it has a fourfold, it has 4 limbs to it. And if you look at limb number 3, it doesn't allow the Parliament to make a law which actually restricts religion. So we in Australia actually have the luxury, if you like, and it is a bit different to the American Constitution on this. We acknowledge the importance of religious freedom. In fact, we say that it's so important and so inalienable and unassailable and wide-ranging that we don't even trust the Parliament of Representatives to make a law which could only narrow it. Does that make sense? So our third limb of section 116 of our Constitution won't even allow the narrowing. I mean, the good thing in Australia is that the government does this as well. We can partner with churches and hospitals and schools and so forth, as long as there's a public interest. We have that freedom. I believe it's more restricted in the US Constitution. So it actually works well what we've got. We're not trammeling that all-important human right. I mean, it's the most basic human right. If you are not allowed to believe what you want, to have the product of your own mind and heart, then really you're not fully human.
Let me do my own shout outs for a moment here. We have our regular viewers out there. Christopher, thank you for watching. Anthony, Cassie, Graham, Linda, Winston, good to see everyone out there watching. We will get to your questions in just a few minutes. If you want to start putting questions in the chat box, we'll get to them in about 10 minutes. But Sophie, I want to ask you first, if that's true, I mean, if religion is so foundational to the foundation of Australia, why is religious liberty such a controversial idea in this country? Why aren't people simply cherishing freedom of religion in Australia?
Okay, well, this has as much to do with our education system as it does to do with our history. So we have this wonderful history where we obviously, the indigenous people who were here had their own beliefs. They had the dream time, the rainbow serpent, the sacred sites, so forth and so forth. Governor Arthur Phillip actually claimed Australia in accordance with the rules, international norms at the time, claimed sovereignty for Britain. And the first thing he did when he stepped ashore was to take the Bible and open it and take an oath on it. He thought that a country that could only be successful and prosperous if it operated under God's laws. And very importantly, and this again goes back to our basic human rights, he declared that there would be no slavery. Now, when you think about the enormity of that, that was 1788, Salvatore. That was before William Wilberforce's big win in 1833 that abolished slavery across the empire, the British Empire. So we are talking a guy who was really ahead of his time, quite revolutionary, but it set an incredible tone for Australia that every single person had their individual dignity recognised. And even when he was attacked himself. He was speared. He ordered there be no retaliation. So he actually set the tone for how Australia was going to be. And it's so important, in my view. Well, it was continued by Governor Lachlan Macquarie. Arthur Phillip was a good Navy man. Lachlan Macquarie was Army. And Lachlan Macquarie carried that on, and so did his wife, Elizabeth Macquarie, and so did people like Caroline Chisholm. Just extraordinary. But the point I was getting to is this. They set a tone, but what we are being taught in education now, what the school children and even some of the unis are teaching, is that these people were shameless and horrible and were only interested in attacking the natives, natives at the time, and so forth. Now, that is actually a travesty, that they are defaming these early pioneers in Australia. Every single building they constructed had to be done by the sweat of their brow and the cutting of the rocks, and they had to plant food and so forth. And it was a very, very tough existence. And of course, they had disease, and all the heat was incredible, and finding water, and just the life then was so tough that I do encourage people to read the life of Caroline Chisholm. My lovely sister Mel gave it to me, and it's just an extraordinary account. But anyway, getting back to your
Grant, I mean, let me push on this a little, because granted that colonial history or early settlement history is often misrepresented in history classrooms. I'm going to grant that fully. But I mean, as an American here, seeing, for example, the glee with which people jumped on Cardinal Pell during the trial, and then the complete lack of remorse when he was found innocent. I mean, I was really shocked at the desire among so many intellectuals in Australia simply to bring down someone because he was religious, or for that matter, the criticism of Scott Morrison for going to church, which just seems the most natural thing in the world to me. I mean, why is there so much hostility towards religion, especially among intellectuals in Australia?
Salvatore, can I address that? I understand the point you're making. There does seem to be hostility amongst a certain set who, because they sensationalise, they tend to dominate the airwaves. But if you actually travel around Australia, every country town you go to, there's churches there. People have their funerals at churches. People christen their babies. People sometimes marry in churches. We have our public holidays, Good Friday, Easter, Christmas. There's a real underlying definite culture. We are also a forgiving, laid-back country. I mean, that's just part of our national trait. Our traits, I would have thought. And I think that is actually what matters. And just getting on to the Pell example that you've given, I hear what you're saying, but there are many people who may not have been close to Pell who were watching all that and felt deeply uncomfortable about it. They saw that the burden of proof, which is meant to be beyond reasonable doubt, if the prosecution is charging you with something, they saw that the burden had been shifted to the accused, and it was set at this ridiculously high standard of, well, it's not impossible. I mean, that's just, most people, I would say, in Australia felt uncomfortable about what was happening there, and relieved that the highest court of our land actually rectified that. So even if they didn't like him, they still thought that the man deserved a fair go before our courts. And I think that is actually the Australian way. I think that the everyday Australian actually does treasure religion in their own way. It permeates their life. I think the mistake would be to assess Australians on what percentage is church going, because Australians, well, yes, they are laid back and they manifest their faith in different ways to perhaps, some Europeans or Middle Easterners or whatever. Different countries have different cultural traits and the way they express things. But we definitely like people to be honest and kind and loving and forgiving. Right. And those traits really come from our founding foundations, which were, of course, Judeo-Christianity. That tone was set from the get-go. And in fact, now many Indigenous people have converted to Christianity as a result of what they've observed about it, right. the beauty that it brings to a culture. And this is not across the world. There are some countries which have major problems with corruption and telling of untruths and bribery and even a mercilessness. I mean, in our law, for example, our tort, that's based on the concept of the Good Samaritan. And I know in America they're conscious of that as well, the duty that you owe to someone that could foreseeably be injured by your act. And our contract law assumes a fair go as well, equal bargaining power and fair play and reasonableness. And of course, our criminal law that we've just been discussing. I mean, crime and sentencing in Australia definitely incorporates the qualities of mercy, forgiveness, redemption. I mean, these are very Christian-based concepts. So it's all there. It's there.
Well, certainly, look, I'm not going to argue that it's there, but let me pull you back to something you talked about at the beginning of that, the tone of debate in Australia. I think we can both agree that the rate of religious observance, number of people who go to church or synagogue or mosque or temple or some institution once a week, has declined dramatically in Australia over the last 50 years. At the same time, society seems less respectful than ever. Do you think there's a connection there?
Look, I to prepare for this, I did have a look at the census stats over the last 10 years, and interestingly, the percentage who are going to identify themselves as having a religion has dropped between, well, I looked at 06 to 2016, the last censuses to compare, and I found that fascinating, and also in particular the percentage who identify themselves as Christian has dropped as well. I think it's now around the 50% mark, but I'd need to pull up the census.
Sure. This isn't a data show, but
I know. And I'd love to commit all the findings. It was so fascinating drilling down into it. But interestingly, the percentage of people who are still church going in that 10 years, so even those who may not reveal to the government in a census that they hold some religion, the percentage, which is around 15 to 17%, in that decade has remained stable. Now, that's very fascinating. So it's not dropping. If anything, it went up a percentage. So it tells me that some people, for whatever reason, they might think, oh, it's none of the government's business to ask about my private faith, or they might have come from a country. We have migrants who have fled oppressive regimes, and they're not willing to share that sort of information with a government authority. They don't know how it could be used against them. So there's multiple reasons for that. Yes.
Well, but I'm going to take for granted that 15 or 20% is pretty low. What I'm asking is that a problem, right? Is that what's responsible for the breakdown of civil debate and our inability, it seems, to be respectful in public in Australian society?
Look, Salvatore, you're right. There is no doubt there has been an impact on respect for religion generally. That is a sad thing in my view, but it may just be a phase that we're going through. I am an optimist, and I think that if you look at the history of the world, I mean, you look at the Roman Empire, where they were busy initially stoning Christians and shooting them full of arrows and all sorts of things like that. And as time went on, the emperor converted to Christianity due to the influence of his lovely mother, and they came up with the Edict of Milan in 313 and 313 AD, and that actually meant people had to respect Christians, restore their property, stop persecuting them, stop killing them. They actually needed that law, and that empire then went from strength to strength. It was one of the biggest, greatest empires of humankind, 1,000 years, and the Roman Empire affected the entire world. Everything from art to architecture, roads, engineering. There's even a Monty Python skit about, but whatever else did they do for us? But they really were quite an extraordinary empire. So, yes, I hear what you're saying, and it may be that we are due for, sadly, legislative protection. I know they're looking at that in New South Wales right now. The Anti-Discrimination Act currently protects all sorts of categories from disability to age, sexual orientation, but it omits this sort of glaring omission of religious freedom, religious liberty. And I do understand that once upon a time we probably didn't need it because there was such an intrinsic
Mm-hmm.
respect for it. People could look around and, they see that, St. Vincent de Paul and these suburbs and train stations and the nuns and brothers, Mary MacKillop, who established 117 schools across Australia, educated the poor and working class of Australia. I mean, we are still reaping the harvest of those early schools that Mary and her nuns, the Joey sisters, set up, and all those nuns and priests and brothers who were the unpaid workforce, and they educated Australia. I mean, that we have such a phenomenal harvest from what was sown then. And one of the things it also did was it sowed the seed of volunteerism. Australia, they've actually assessed, there's studies you can read on this, they've assessed the value of our culture, which is very into volunteerism. And that's giving of yourself for no pay. And they believe it's worth 290 billion every year. Now, we are one of the wealthiest countries in the world. That value, that not all countries have that in their culture, that's definitely has been inculcated over time. So yes, I do hear what you're saying, and it may be that partly through ignorance or partly through, antipathy for whatever reason, people sometimes their politics overtakes them, and they probably lose respect for other people, and how they carry out that is, in faith bashing. And look, there have been some scandals over the years which haven't helped. There's a percentage of wrongdoers in any outfit.
Sure.
Deals with children, and that's across the board. There's everything from
sure.
Yeah, so that hasn't helped, that there's been that saturation coverage of that tiny percentage of wrongdoers. So all that feeds into it. But people, I think, they love the fact that we have these wonderful hospitals and schools and colleges, Christian colleges, camp Celsia, outfits like that. People are, I think Australians are delighted that we have the culture that we have. I mean, overseas visitors comment on it. They find us
we all of us really love Australia.
Look, can I just make one last point? When there is a belief in God or in a higher force, a creator, there's a certain humility that goes with that, and I think that makes people endearing. And when people discard it or are rude or dismissive, that brings a certain arrogance. And I like to think the Australians actually do have that innate humility, which is very endearing. But anyway, it's because they acknowledge that there's a higher force than themselves, that they're not the source of all, quality and creation.
Well, there's certainly a higher force than me, and that force is YouTube. I would like to ask everyone to please like this video if you are liking it. Hey, if you don't like the video, dislike it. It's engagement that matters on YouTube, and we'd like to make sure that more people have a chance to see Sophie's comments. The more people interact with the video, and that means likes, dislikes, making your comments in the comment section, the more people will see this video. Of course, we'd also love you to subscribe to the YouTube channel here at the Center for Independent Studies. That will allow, again, you and other people to see more of our videos. I'd also like to ask for your money. I would love to have you join the Center for Independent Studies if you're not already a member. Joining starts at $40 for a basic membership, and that'll get you pretty much everything you need. But if you do want to join at the $250 level, instead of something you need, you can get something you want. Liberty and Liberalism, personally signed by me, the first work of classical liberalism published in Australia. This is a reprint done by the Center for Independent Studies. If you upgrade to that higher membership status, if you're already a member, I'll still send you a copy of Liberty and Liberalism. If you do so in response to this show, just let them know in the comments when you donate. We would love to have your support. Remember, there's a coronavirus on. Donations are way down for everything. Give to your religious institution that you attend. I'd say put that first. Put us second. We'd really love to get your support. We are the Center for Independent Studies, meaning that we don't take any government money. We don't take sponsored research for specific purposes. We only rely on donations from people like you. Sophie, thanks for sitting through my crass materialism there. I do have questions.
Very
Hey, I'm American.
Can I add, Salvatore? Can I add to it? Look, my experience of the CIS has always been very positive. I love the fact that you're not afraid of debate. You even get the tough subjects and you flesh them out, and it is independent. And the papers that you produce, and I've got that book, by the way. I haven't read it yet, but I'm very excited about it, so thank you. But the papers that you produce are so trustworthy and reliable. It's wonderful because you can really we all sort of need resources when we're making an argument. Helen Alvarez, she's American actually, she did the Hobby Lobby case. She said, be the best in the room. If you want to make an argument, be the best in the room. And Alan Jones, of course, says, do the homework. And it's hard to have the time to do all the research. So the CIS provides, they have their hardworking team do all the hard work, the legwork, the research. And that to me is so valuable. I cannot tell you.
Well, thank you for the plug. Much appreciated. Thank you, Sophie. Look, Christopher has a question for you. As people become increasingly divorced from traditional religious and moral values, is there a growing risk of a quasi-voluntary totalitarianism that we fall into, a sort of totalitarianism here in Australia?
Oh, gosh. Okay. Well, if we get on to the China topic at some point, Salvatore, I do hope
do that right now if you want.
All right. Well, okay. I'm going to address it this way. We in Australia, my impression is that generally Australians haven't really suffered for their beliefs. And it's been, we've lived such a free existence that we're sort of allowing at the moment the encroachment of a major power in the world, the People's Republic of China, and we're so good-natured that we're actually letting it happen before our eyes. They're taking over, the Port of Darwin, Port of Newcastle, Port of Melbourne, cementing over reefs in our region, our major waterway. A lot of our 2/3 of our exports go past there. It's worth a fortune to us. Whoever controls that waterway really has a sort of Damocles over our whole country. But if you look at that government that is expanding its control, and I just read this morning in the paper that they have hacked our parliament and that they are doing all sorts of cyber activity that's not in our interests. I mean, they're meant to be a trading partner. Perhaps we need to revise that language. Partner is a very intimate word, and it brings a lot of cachet of trust. So I think I hear what Christopher's question is, and I think the biggest danger to our freedom is partly the political correctness that's within that is making people constrained. They feel that they can't discuss things. We certainly saw that in the marriage debate. People were threatened and intimidated and so forth. It was quite unpleasant. Even a beer company was boycotted. I mean, it really was quite extraordinary. They were just having a couple of MPs having a debate with a beer there, and then the beer company cancelled its run of the 200th anniversary of the Bible Society. They were meant to make beer cans with lovely Bible verses on them, but they felt too afraid. They did what only be described as a hostage video where they said, we support, gay marriage. I mean, it was really horrible that time. And it really made me realise that whatever we'd had up until to date where people were allowing space for each other's views, during the marriage debate, I saw that there was definitely a politically correct group that were not countenance other people expressing their views, even though those views might be based on thousands of years of humankind and also, based on advice from the Son of God. So, about love and forgiveness and so forth. So, So anyway, so my view is that the totalitarian shift has been a little bit accelerated by this current pandemic. I mean, the reason we're doing this on Skype is because there's been a novel coronavirus that escaped from a lab in Wuhan in China, and the initial cases were genomically linked to that lab. So very serious times that we're in. But the big issue about the pandemic is what it has caused. It has weakened the world health-wise, wealth-wise, and a consciousness of freedom. That, to me, is one of the most significant shifts. If you watch everything, don't forget I am a legal philosopher, so I do look at underlying philosophies and trajectories. So that's what I'm most conscious of, because once you give up that mentality of I'm a free, autonomous, independent human and I have my own human rights of the ability to think and speak and move freely. And once you give that up, it's very hard to get it back. It's usually only won back with bloodshed. I'm not saying that to be dramatic, but if you look at the history of humankind, and especially, I mean, they know this in the Eastern Bloc, the people who won their freedom there. I mean, Polish people, Hungarian people, it was very, very tough for them to win back their freedom. So Christopher's point is well made. I think totalitarianism can come in a number of different forms. Orwell pointed out that usually there's a false banner. So they call, love is called hate, freedom, slavery, all those sorts of things. And we're taught
serve the people.
Yes, that's right. We're taught at the moment that safety is more important than freedom. And of course, we know the quote from Benjamin Franklin that if you sacrifice essential freedoms for temporary safety, you don't deserve either, and you'll end up with neither. So that's a very important point. So I think the only recommendation I can make is that when we see this, where people are being, made to feel uncomfortable at work. I mean, the most prominent case was our genius rugby union player. I mean, he was taken off the field, Israel Folau, and it was really, he put a post in response to his employer putting out a view on marriage that he could not agree with. So he had to put it. He felt in conscience he had to put it. And you saw the public really support him. Australians love their freedom, and they also don't want authority outfits, their boss, for example, in this case it was Rugby Australia, to dictate to them what views they're allowed to have. And he put a respectful post that was in response to what his employer was declaring on behalf of all players.
I'm sure Christopher will appreciate that very full response. We're going to have to cut down the response a bit because we have a ton of questions to get to.
Sorry,
I'm going to ask you to put your barrister's hat on if you never took it off. We have a question from Winton. Sophie, do you think it's important to distinguish between natural rights and the kinds of rights specified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
Distinguish between the natural
rights
and DHR. Yeah. Okay, so can I just make this point? You have naturally occurring human rights. Whether they ever end up acknowledged in a document is neither here nor there. How wonderful, in my view, that they have been acknowledged over the years. So we mentioned Magna Carta and the earliest legal codes, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it has a special status, if you like. All the countries across the world recognise that it's now part of customary international law. And in it does acknowledge that we have these important human rights, the right to have a conscience and the right to found a family and so forth, and the right to be at liberty and not to be locked up arbitrarily and all those things. So whether or not it's written in a document, Magna Carta, you name it, that doesn't change the fact that you have this. Whether or not your government takes rights off you, they are just your representatives, and sometimes they secure the role of governing to themselves and don't give you a choice about it, or they are one-party state or whatever. But that doesn't mean that you don't have those naturally occurring human rights. And there's more written about this. Cicero wrote about this. Aristotle's written about this. Augustine of Hippo has written about this. In fact, if you want to delve down, and Thomas Aquinas, but if you want to delve down into it, have a look at the works of Augustine of Hippo, because just extraordinary. And he coined the term just war. And that is based on the fact that people shouldn't just be killed randomly, because you have the right to be alive. And that doesn't change just because nations are fighting. There has to be a good reason to go to war. But anyway, have a look at him.
So Anthony wants to bring us back to the present. He's asking, history is a big place. Since some cultures do not accept religious freedom and even jury systems may be compromised, is it possible that multiculturalism could be incompatible with a free society?
So people have a different understanding of what the word multicultural means. In my view, Australia has its own culture, but within it, we have different races. We have, people coming from different countries, but we have an Australian culture, and in it we absorb people from different cultural backgrounds, but we have our own culture, and it's very beautiful. Part of that culture is actually that relishing in the different cultures of people from different backgrounds. That's actually part of the Australian culture. We're not trying to be homogenous, but I tend to not use the word multicultural because I feel that divides people into silos, and it's sort of bagging and tagging. I'm not really into all the bagging and tagging that's going on at the moment, and deciding that people have to be treated in different ways depending on how they rank in that bagging and tagging. And I just think that that really gets away from the starting point, which is that we each are a human being. We need to treat each other with respect and love and forgiveness if we need to, and so forth. So I acknowledge that having a multi-ethnic society, or polyethnic, however you want to describe it, having this beautiful melting pot has enriched our country beyond compare. We are so lucky in Australia, and our culture of people not going berserk when someone makes a point they disagree with, thinking about it, that's a beautiful thing. In some countries, that'll get you killed or put in jail for blasphemy, or stabbed, or bombed, or whatever. So that's an important part of our culture. Yeah.
Graham suggests that when active participation in church life fades, all that remains is a kind of cultural Christianity. And he's curious what you think. Does cultural Christianity have its own value to Australian society today?
It's a good question, because whenever you stop replenishing from the source, there is a risk that you will dehydrate, or it will dry up. So if you look at anything in life, the source of life from it is replenishment. So when you look at what churches offer, they, read the gospel reading. They have a faith leader, often well-versed in theology, that will explain it and give examples. It's so important for people to sort of have that replenishment, that spiritual replenishment. And also, if you're a Christian, you'll remember at the Last Supper, Jesus said, break bread, broke wine, do this in memory of me. Getting people together, do this in memory of me. That was a specific request. So it's something that we do in the Catholic tradition, and the Christian tradition is very much to do that. And of course, there are many other faiths that bring people together and they rejuvenate, because it's very hard to keep all the readings, if you're people of the book, all the readings in your head, and also to have all the depth of understanding. Not everyone does a PhD in theology, for example. So it's so lovely to have this on offer. And there is a risk that if you never replenish, that eventually it will dissipate and you won't have that wonderful nourishment. It's a form of nourishment. So getting back to the first point, we are physical, intellectual, and spiritual. And physically, would we stop eating, or would we stop, intellectually, would we stop reading or stop absorbing new information? For some reason, people think that spiritually we can just no longer. I do acknowledge you can get spiritual nourishment from not just going to church, though. There are plenty of ways of doing that. There's nothing to stop you praying wherever you are and reading the gospel wherever you are. So that's true. But the idea of gathering people together to break bread is and to actually do that in memory of Jesus is a very significant thing. It's not something to just.
Well, a lot of people may not realize our very word companionship means to break bread with people. Linda has a comment for us. The volunteer industry, and she puts in quotation marks, is huge in Australia. It's blessed with many talented, willing people, distinctly more than other countries. Sophie, your insights into how it developed are much appreciated. Also, you have a thanks from George to Sophie. Mara has a comment that I'm going to turn into a question. If active participation of church life fades, is it possible that people are preaching from the pulpit a kind of politically correct gospel and thus diluting it entirely?
Look, I'm so glad. Sorry, who asked that question?
This is Mara, but she's put it as a comment. I'm turning it into a question.
Delighted, Mara. I'm so glad you asked that question. Look, only yesterday I was reading this letter that about 200 young Australians have written to a conference of bishops, a synod of bishops, and they really were asking. I skim-read it. I had lots of homework, but I was very encouraged in it that they are seeking leadership, seeking clarity. They don't want the politically correct woke view of the world. They actually want to know the doctrinal truths and also have them transmitted with confidence and belief that's visceral, that they can pick up on and relish in and pass on to others and so forth. So it would be a sad thing, and I know that some faith leaders want to not ruffle any feathers, don't want to offend people, but we need to actually perhaps reorientate our consciousness and think that having a point of view or a belief that's different to someone else's is not of itself offensive. It's John Milbank who wrote about that in his Ontology of Peace. He said that's actually how you have a peaceful, flourishing society. You allow space for each other. And how enriching is it to have people with different views? So faith leaders should be out and proud, for want of a better term, and should just think this is what we believe, and they'll gather together. They will attract people like a magnet because they believe it, and there's nothing more infectious. That's why, starting with this little band of 12 followers, Christianity spread across the world because Paul believed it, Francis Xavier believed it. They travelled, and Matteo Ricci went into China. I mean, the cathedral he built in Beijing in 1600s is still there now. These people travelled under terrible conditions to spread what they believed in. There wasn't political correctness going on. They could have been killed at the drop of a hat. And many of
them were. Look, we're supposed to be wrapping up, but I have two final questions that I need to squeeze in just because our viewers have been so good to contribute them. The first, George asks, Linda seconds it. Can Sophie say something, this is his word, briefly, about the limits of limits of religious freedom?
The limits. Okay. Well, we, as you know, in the law, we do have, a Crimes Act. So if your religion, for example, asked you to, slay other people, well, that, of course, that's denying other people their human rights. You have your natural human rights to the extent that they abut other people's. So, of course, if you had a belief, and also if you were part of an outfit that did not allow other people or people within it to change their minds, part of freedom of belief is that you can change your mind at any point. So if the belief or system that you're in will not allow that, then it actually defies the definition of religion, because part of religion is freely believing and being able to change and so forth. So yes, there would need to be limits because each individual is entitled to their own human rights and to not have them trammeled upon by others. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. We have a final question from Graham, and we're going to have to wrap up after this question. But Graham says, American scholar Henry Van Til wrote more than 60 years ago that culture is just the outward expression of inward religious beliefs. Do you agree?
Yes. That's actually beautiful, that quote. I mean, I'm just looking around. When you see beautiful art and architecture and poetry and literature that's been produced over thousands of years, and it's driven by faith, it's almost a manifestation, and that ends up being such a part of the culture. You can see it. It's encoded in that product of human creativity and so forth. And conversely, when the culture becomes rotten or shallow or aggressive or transactional, you start seeing art and architecture that's repugnant and not uplifting and sometimes perverted and shallow and meaningless and not rich and beautiful and uplifting. So you definitely see it reflects. It's a two-way reflection, actually. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, you look at how the world wept when Notre Dame was on fire. They realised that something magnificent was possibly being destroyed. Anyway, fortunately it wasn't, but that's...
Well, Sophie, thank you for uplifting us up today. Very much appreciated.
Oh, Salvatore, it's been such a joy, and thank you to all your audience, and thank you for your wonderful questions and for bringing me on this exceptional show. Keep going, Salvatore.
We'll have to do it again soon. Thank you very much. Our producer today was Emily Holmes, executive producer Max Hawk-Weaver. The director of the Center for Independent Studies is Tom Switzer, and you can join us next week when Tom will be handicapping the American elections. Join us next Thursday. We hope you see us then.
Thanks, Salvatore. Thanks, Max and Tom.